Chapter 16. The voyage back to Koshai had been a week-long nightmare. When she had been the pride and budget wrecker of transcontinental and overseas airline, the Harriet Barn had accommodated 200 first-class and 500 lower-deck passengers, but the conversion to a spaceship had drastically reduced her capacity. The 300 men and women who had been recruited for the Koshai colony had been crammed into her with brutal disregard for comfort, privacy, or anything else except the ability of the air recyclers to keep them breathing. When Captain Nichols set her down at the administration building at Port Carpenter, a few had to be carried off, but they were all alive, which made the trip an unqualified success. The dozen leaders of the expedition were congratulating themselves on that in one of the executive offices after the first dinner at Port Carpenter. Rodney Maxwell in Storesand had joined them in screen image. He was mostly listening, and sometimes contributing a remark apropos of something the rest of them had said 5 minutes ago. "Our hypership," Conn was saying, "is going to have to be item 2 on the agenda. The first thing we need is a ship for the Poictesme Koshai run. By this time next year, we ought to have 1,000 to 1,500 people here at the least. We can't haul them all on that flying sardine can. We'll need supplies, too. What was left here won't last forever," Nichols added. "And you're going to have to run this at a profit," Luther Chen Wong, who had come along for first-hand experience and to help with administrative work, added. "You have a big payroll to meet, and you'll have to keep the stockholders happy. People like Jethro Sasterman and some of those store-send bankers aren't going to be satisfied with promises and long-term prospects. They'll want dividends. We'll have to get claims staked on something besides Port Carpenter, too. Those ships that are building at Storesand will be finished before long," Jerry Rivas said. "If we don't get some more things claimed, the first thing you know, we'll own Port Carpenter and nothing else." "Well, let's see what we can find in the way of a big airboat or a small ship," Conn said. "Jerry, you can pick a party for exploring. Just zigzag around the planet and transmit in locations and views of whatever you find, and we'll send it on to Storesand. And don't pick anybody for your exploring party that can't be spared from anything here," Jacquemont added. "We don't want to have to chase you halfway around the world to bring back the only specialist in something yesterday at the latest." "Are you going to come along, Conn?" Rivas asked. "Oh, Lord, no. I'm going to be doing 15 things at once here. All the computer work. Finding materials to make astrogational equipment and robopilots, studying hyperspace theory. Fortunately, there was an excellent library here, and setting up classes and teaching school, and keeping in touch with his father on Poictesme. It was making him nervous not to know what sort of foolishness the older and wiser heads might be getting into. The next morning, they began organizing work gangs and setting up committees. 3 men, 2 girls, and about 20 robots got an open pit iron mine started as soon as the steel mill was ready or started coming in. Hans Dawes had a gang looking for something they could build a 350-foot interplanetary ship out of. Jacquemont and Mac Vibart were getting plans and specifications and making lists of needed materials. Conn gathered a dozen men and women and started classes in computer theory and practice. At the same time, he and Charlie Gatworth were teaching themselves and each other hyperspatial astrogation, which was the art of tossing a ship into some everythingless no place outside normal space-time, and then pulling her out again by her bootstraps at some other place in the normal continuum, light years away. Roughly, it compared to shooting hummingbirds on the wing, blindfolded with a not particularly accurate pistol from a mile-a-minute merry-go-round. That was something you could only do with a computer. A human, with a slide rule, a pencil, and pad, could figure it out, of course, if he had 50-odd thousand years to do it. A good computer did it in 30 seconds. That was one difference between people and computers. The other difference was that the desirability of making a hyperspace jump would never occur to a computer unless somebody pushed a button and taped in instructions. They found a 300-foot globular skeleton, probably the nucleus of a big hyperspace ship, and decided that was big enough for what they wanted. The entire colony got to work on it. Photo-printed plans and specifications poured out as Jacquemont and a couple of draftsmen got them up. Steel came out of the steel mill at one end, while ore came in at the other. A swarm of big contragravity machines, some robotic and some human-operated, clustered around the skeletal hull like hornets building a nest. Tri-System and Interstellar Space Lines was chartered. The lawyers reported having to overcome a little more resistance than usual from the government about that. And the bill to nationalize Merlin, which had died in committee, was resuscitated and was being debated hotly on the floor of Parliament. The administration was now supporting it. Are they completely crazy? Conn wanted to know when he heard about that. They passed that bill and nobody's going to look for Merlin if they know the government will snatch it as soon as they find it. That is precisely Jake Vakovin's idea, his father replied. I told you he was afraid of Merlin. He's getting more afraid of it every day. He had reason to. There was a growing sentiment in favor of turning the entire government over to the computer as soon as it was found. To his horror, Conn heard himself named as chairman of a committee that should be set up to operate it. The moderates, who had merely wanted Merlin used in an advisory capacity, were dropping out. The agitation was coming from extremists who wanted Merlin to be the whole government, and now the extremists were developing an extreme wing of their own, who called themselves cybernarchists, and started wearing colored shirt uniforms and greeting each other with an archaic stiff-arm salute and the words, "Hail Merlin!" And the followers of the gospel shouter on the west coast were now cropping up all over the mainland and on the continent of Acare to the north, and another cult, non-religious, was convinced that Merlin was a living machine with conscious intelligence of its own and awesome psi powers, a sort of super golem, which, if found and awakened, would enslave the whole galaxy. Fortunately, these two hated each other as venomously as both did the cybernarchists, and spent most of their energies attacking each other's meetings. The news services were beginning to publish casualty lists, some heavy enough for outpost fighting between a couple of regular armies. One thing, it helped the employment situation. Everybody was hiring mercenaries. But what, Conn asked, are the sane people doing? You ought to know, his father told him. I suspect that you have all of them on Koshai now. The sane people, if that was what they were being busy. They were putting a set of Abbott lift and drive engines together, and Conn's computer class was estimating the mass of the finished ship and the amount of energy needed to overcome gravitation and give it constant acceleration from Koshai to Poictesme. They were learning, by trial and error, largely error, how to build a set of pseudograv engines, and they were putting together 101 other things, all of which was good training for the time they'd be ready to start work on Ouroboros II. Jerry Rivas had found a contragravity craft which seemed to have been used by some top official for business and inspection trips, had gathered a crew of non-specialists who weren't urgently needed at Port Carpenter, and set out to circumnavigate the planet. It worked just the reverse of expectation. You found a big uranium mine with an isotope separation plant and a battery of plutonium breeders. That meant that Mohammed Matsui and half a dozen other nuclear power people had to get into another boat and speed after him to see what he had really found. As soon as they landed, Rivas took off again to discover a copper mine and a complex of smelters and processing plants. That took a few more experts, or reasonable facsimiles, away from Port Carpenter. And then he found a whole city that manufactured nothing but computers and robocontrols and things like that. Conn loaded his whole computer theory class onto a freight scow and took them there. By the time he landed, his father was screening him from Storrs End. "When are you going to get the ship finished?" he was asking. "Kurt Fozzie's pestering the daylights out of me. He wants that equipment you promised him." "We're working on it." "What's happened? Has Carl Liebert had another revelation?" "I don't know about that. Kurt's sure Merlin is directly under Force Command. And speaking about Liebert, Clem Zareff's been after me about him. You know, I've contracted for the full-time and exclusive services of this Barton Massar detective agency. Well, Clem wants me to put them to work investigating Liebert." "Yes, I know. Liebert's a Terran Federation spy. Why do you need the full-time services of the biggest private detective agency on Poictesme?" "There have been some odd things happening. People have been trying to bribe and intimidate some of my office help. I found microphones and screen pickups planted around. I caught one of our clerks trying to make copies of voice tapes. I think it's some of these other Merlin chasing companies trying to find out how close we are to it. Clem Zaref is recruiting more guards. But how soon are you going to get that ship built? We're working on it. That's all I know now. He went back to work getting a classroom ready for his students. If he'd accepted that instructorship at Montevideo, he wouldn't be a full professor now, but none of the rest of this would be happening either. That night he had the dream about starting the big machine and not being able to stop it again. There was street fighting in Storsend between the cybernarchists and government troops. There was a pitched battle in the west between the Armageddonists, Merlin is Satan, and the Human Supremacy League, Merlin is the Golem, with heavy losses and claims of victory on both sides. President Vykoven proclaimed planet-wide martial law and then discovered that he had nothing to enforce it with. Luther Chen Wong screened him from Port Carpenter. His voice was almost inaudibly low at first. Conn, I just had a call from Jerry and Clyde. I think we can knock off work on that ship we're building now. We won't need it. Have they found a ship? If they had, it would be the first one anybody had found. Where? They haven't found a ship, Conn. They've found all of them. All the ships in the Alpha system except the Harriet Barn and the two they're building at Storsend. The places marked on the map as Sickle Mountain Naval Observatory. It's just a bitty little dot, but the map was made before the evacuation started. It's where most of the troops in the system were embarked on hyperships, I think. Wait till I show you the views. Conn put on another screen. The first view was from an altitude of 5 miles. He didn't need Luther's voice to identify Sickle Mountain, a long curve with a spur at right angles to one end. The name must have suggested itself to whoever saw it first. The observatory had been built where the handle of the sickle joined the blade. As the ship from which the view had been taken had approached, the details grew plainer. At the same time, it became evident that the plane inside the curve of the sickle was powdered with tiny sparkles like tinsel dust on red-brown velvet. Great goo! Are those all ships? That's right. Look at this one now. The view changed. The aircraft was down now, below the crest of the mountain, circling slowly above the plain. Hundreds, no, over 1,000, 2 and 3 and 500 footers, and here and there 1,000-footer that could have been converted into a hypership if anybody had wanted to take the trouble. The view changed again, this time from an air car dropped from the ship, he supposed. It was down almost to the tops of the ships, and he could read names and home ports. Pixie, Chloris, Helena Loy, Anitis. They were from Jurgen. Sky Rover, Port Saunders. She was from Horvendale. Ships from Storsend and Yellow Marsh on Janicot, and now we know where they all went. It was logical, of course. Most of the hyperships used in the evacuation had been built here. It had been less trouble to lead the troops and the civilian workers from Poictesme and the other planets onto some small normal spaceships and bring them here than to take the big ships away on short interplanetary runs to the other planets. Have you screened my father yet? Yes. This is going to knock the bottom out of the companies that are building those ships at Storsend, I'm afraid. They're tough luck. It could be everybody's tough luck. Both those companies have been issuing stock, and there's been a lot of speculation in it. This market's so inflated now that a puncture at one place might blow the whole thing out. He knew that. He shrugged. Father will have to think of something. Tell him I'll screen him from Sickle Mountain. Then he went back to his classroom. All right, class dismissed, he said. You have 20 minutes to get your bags packed. We're going to work for real now. Airboats and airships flocked to Sickle Mountain. Some of them hastened back to Port Carpenter for loads of food, for there was none in the storehouses at the embarkation camp. They inspected ship after ship and chose 2 300-footers. They sent airships and freight scows to the dozen-odd cities and industrial centers that had been already explored to gather cargo, as far as possible the items in shortest supply on Poictesme. Don't worry about a market smash, his father told him. We have that taken care of. Tri-System Investments has just bought up a lot of stock in both of those companies, and we've set up agreements with them, informally, of course. We'll have to get them voted on by our own companies to sell them ships from Koshai. In return, the company that's building the ship out of 4 air freighters will go to Janikot, and the company that's building a ship out of the old Leitzen building will go to Jurgen, and they'll both stay off Koshai. Sturber, Flynn, and Chen Wong will probably be defending antitrust suits till the end of time. The planetary government has stopped liking us, you know. And we'll have to get one that will like us. There'll be an election about this time next year, won't there? His father nodded. To use one of your expressions, we're working on it. How soon can you get your ships in? We'll be loaded and ready to lift off in a week. Another week for the trip. Well, don't forget that equipment you promised Kurt Fozzie. We'll have that on. Jerry Rivas is gathering it up now. How are you fixed for arms on Koshai? Arms? Why, there are some. There was a pretty big force of Space Marines on duty here, and they left everything they couldn't carry in their hands. Why? The Armageddonists and the Cybernarchists and Human Supremacy bought all you had on hand? They're buying, but I wasn't thinking of that. I was thinking that your crews might need something to argue their way off those ships at Storis End with. Things are getting just slightly rugged here now. Chapter 17. There were no bands or speeches when they came in this time. A lot of contragravity vehicles circled widely around the spaceport, but except for a few news service cars, the police were keeping them back of a 2-mile radius around the landing pits. A couple of gunboats were making tight circles above, and on the dock were more vehicles and a horde of police and guards. When Rodney Maxwell came across the bridge from the dock after they opened the airlocks, he was followed by a dozen Barton Massara private police, as villainous-looking a collection of ruffians as Conn had ever seen. He was wearing a new suit with a waist-length jacket instead of the long coat he usually wore, and there was a holstered automatic on each hip. In Litchfield, he never carried more than one pistol, and Storis End was supposed to be an orderly place where nobody needed to go armed. More than anything else, that told Conn Maxwell approximately what had been going on while he had been on Koshai. Ship guard, his father told Hughes Jackmont. All your crew can come off. They'll take care of things. Get your people in that troop carrier over there. Everybody will stay at the interplanetary building. None of the hotels are safe, not even the Ritz-Gardner. And be sure everybody's well armed when they come off the ship. Jackmont nodded. I know the drill. I've been in Port Oberth on Venus and Skorvan on Loki. Any law we want, we make for ourselves. That's about it. I'll see you there. Conn, I wish you'd come with me. Somebody here wants to talk to you. He wondered if his mother or Flora had come to Storis End. When he asked his father as they crossed onto the deck, there was a brief twinge of pain in Rodney Maxwell's face. No, they're not having anything to do. Duck, quick! Then his father was diving under a lifter truck that stood empty on the dock. The private police were scattering for cover, and an autocannon began bomb-bombing. Conn took one quick look in the direction in which it was firing, saw an air car that had broken through the police line and was rushing toward them, and dived under the lifter after his father. As he did, he saw a missile flash out from one of the gunboats like a thrown knife. Then he huddled beside his father and put his arms over his head. He felt the heat and shock of the explosion, and an instant later heard the roar. When nothing immediately disastrous happened after he had counted 15 seconds, he stuck his head out and looked up. The gunboat was struggling to regain her equilibrium, and the air car had vanished in a fireball. They both emerged, straightening. His father was brushing himself with his hands and saying something about always having to duck under something when he had a new suit on. Robot-controlled, probably. Could have been launched from anywhere in town. Oh, I know. Your mother and Flora aren't speaking to either of us anymore. Pity, of course, but I'm glad they're at Litchfield. It's a little healthier there. They walked to the slim recon car and climbed in, pulling the door shut after him. Wade Lucas was waiting for them at the controls. There, you see, he began, as soon as he had the car lifting. What I've been telling you. We'll have to stop this. Conn, meet our new partner. I told him everything you told me out on the mall the day you came home. I had to, his father hastened to add. He'd figured most of it out for himself. The only thing to do was admit him to the lodge and give him the oath. I didn't know about General Travis. I didn't know he was even still alive, Lucas said. But the rest of it was pretty obvious once I stopped jumping to conclusions and did a little thinking. You know, ever since I came here, I've been preaching to these people to stop looking for Merlin and do something to help themselves. You're smarter than I am, Conn. Instead of opposing them, you're guiding them. Did you tell Flora? Lucas shook his head. I tried to explain what you're going to do, but she wouldn't listen. She just told me I'd gotten to be as big a crook as you two. He had the car up to 50,000, putting it into a wide circle around the city. He locked the controls and got out his cigarettes. Rod, we've got to stop this. You were just lucky this time. Some of these days, your luck's going to run out. How can we stop? Conn demanded. Tell them the truth? They'd lynch us, and then go on hunting for Merlin. Worse than that. It'd be a smash worse than the one when the war ended. I was only 10 then, but I can remember that very plainly. We can't stop it, and we wouldn't dare stop it if we could. Worse than that. It'd be a smash worse than the one when the war ended. I was only 10 then, but I can remember that very plainly. We can't stop it, and we wouldn't dare stop it if we could. What's been going on here in the last month? Conn asked. I've been too busy to keep in touch. I know there's been rioting and these crackpot sects, but I think this is personal to us. There have been some ugly things happening. There were 4 attempts to burglarize our offices. I told you about some of the other stuff, the microphones we found, and so on. The worst thing was Lucy Nocero, my secretary. She just vanished a couple of weeks ago. 3 days later, the police found her wandering in a park, a complete imbecile. Somebody who either didn't know how to use one or didn't care what happened had used a mind probe on her. It's 20 to 1 she'll never recover. It's the Storrs and financial crowd, Wade Lucas said. They had things all their own way till Alpha Interplanetary was organized. Now they're getting shoved into the background, and they don't like it. They're making more money than ever did, and they just love it, Rodney Maxwell said. I'd think it was either Jake Vykoven or Sam Murchison. Murchison, Lucas hooted. Why, he's nobody. Federation Minister General, all the authority of the Terran Federation, and nothing to enforce it with. He doesn't have a position here. He's a disease, sleeping sickness. He certainly doesn't believe there is a Merlin, does he? Conn asked. I don't know what he believes, but he's getting to be Clem Zareff's opposite number. He thinks this whole thing's a plot against the Federation. It's a good thing Clem didn't get around to repainting his combat vehicles black and green, the way he did the Home Guard stuff at Litchfield. I'd be more likely to think it was Vykoven. Could be, or it could be the Armageddonists, or human supremacy. I'm ashamed to say that this Hail Merlin cybernarchus gang are friendly to us, or it could be some of the banking crowd, or some of these rival space companies. Barton Massar is trying to find out. Well, we have some of Wade's pet suspects at the Interplanetary building now. There's been a meeting going for the last week to partition the Alpha Gardner system. The Interplanetary building had been a medium-class residence hotel at the time of the war. Junior staff officers and civilian technicians and their families had lived there. It had been vacant ever since the disastrous outbreak of peace. Now it had a big new fluorite sign and housed the offices of all the Maxwell companies. There was a truculent display of anti-vehicle weapons on the top landing stage, and more Barton Massar private police. They looked even more villainous than the ones at the spaceport. Conn recalled having heard that most of the Blackie Perales gang had been discharged for lack of evidence. He wondered how many of them had hired with Barton Massara. The meeting was in a big conference room 6 floors down. It had been going on uninterrupted for days, with all the interested companies' representatives standing watch and watch around the clock. Lester Dawes and Morgan Gatworth and Lorenzo Menardis were there for LE&S. Transcontinent and Overseas was represented. There were people from Alpha Interplanetary, and bankers and financiers, and people from the companies building the 2 ships of the spaceport, and J. Fitzwilliam Sturber, the lawyer, and reporters, phoning stories in and getting audiovisual interviews of anybody who would hold still long enough. They converged in a rush as Conn and his father and Lucas came in. No statement, gentlemen, Rodney Maxwell shouted above the babble of their questions. When we have anything to release, it will be released to all of you. Jacques Mont and Nichols had already arrived. Lucas went to them and began talking about stevedores and lifters to get off the cargoes from the ships. Conn hastened to join them. "The scanning and mining equipment aboard the Helen O'Loy," he said. "That shouldn't be unloaded here. We'll take the ship out to Force Command and unload it there." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a lurking reporter snatch the handphone off his radio and began talking. It would be stated authoritatively that Merlin was at Force Command and would be uncovered as soon as special equipment from Koshai arrived. Everybody at the long table was shouting at everybody else. The Jurgen and Janicot companies wanted to buy ships from Koshai Exploitation and Development. The Alpha Interplanetary Director, who was also a vice president of Transcontinent and Overseas, opposed that. Another director of AI, who was also board chairman of Koshai Exploitation and Development, wanted to sell ships to anybody who had the price. The Transcontinent and Overseas man was calling him a traitor to the company, and one of the stockbrokers, who was also a vice president of Tri-System Investments and a director of Tri-System Interstellar Space Lines, was wanting to know which company, and a banker who was stockholder in all the companies was shouting that they were all a gang of crooks, and J. Fitzwilliam Sturber was declaring that anybody who called him a crook could continue the discussion through seconds. Conn suddenly realized that dueling had never been illegal on Poictesme. He wondered how many duels this meeting was going to hatch. The next afternoon, the Helen O'Loy was unloaded, all but the mining equipment. Conn and Yves Jacquemont and Charlie Gatworth and a few others took her out to Force Command. They were met by Clem Zareff's armed airboats 250 miles from the mesa, and they found the place in more of a state of siege than when the Badlands had been full of outlaws. A lot of heavy armament seemed to have been moved in from Barathrum Spaceport, and Zareff had more men and firepower than he had ever commanded during the System States War. If Minister General Murchison was convinced that the Merlin excitement was a cover for some seditious plot against the Federation, this ought to give him food for thought. There was still work, mostly boring lateral shafts for echo shots, going on at the Butte, under the relay station. That was Liebert, who was still insisting that that was where Merlin was buried. There was also some work on top of the mesa by those who were convinced that that was where Merlin was to be found. Kurt Fozzie was taking the lead in that. Franz Veltrin and Dolph Kelton sided with Liebert, and Fozzie's office clique had split into two factions. Judge Ledoux was maintaining strict impartiality, as befitted his judicial position. "Why hasn't your father gotten those detectives of his to work on this fake preacher?" Zareff wanted to know, when he and Tom Brangwyn were able to talk to Conn alone. "Well, they've been busy," Conn said, "trying to keep him alive, for one thing. You heard about the robobomb somebody launched at us the day we brought the ships in, didn't you?" "Yes." "And we heard about the Nucero girl, too," Brangwyn said. "But hasn't it ever occurred to you or your dad that this fellow that calls himself Liebert might be mixed up with the gang that did that?" "You suspect him, too?" Brangwyn nodded. "I took a few audiovisuals of him. When he didn't know it, I sent them to some different law enforcement people over in Morven, where he says he comes from. They never saw him before, and couldn't find anybody who did." "Well, he just doesn't have a police record, then." "He says he's a preacher. Preachers don't go off in the woods by themselves to preach. They get up in pulpits in front of a lot of people. Those towns over in Morven are small enough for everybody to have known something about him. He's a fake, I tell you." "Let me have copies of those audiovisuals, Tom. I'll see what can be found out about him. I'm beginning to wonder about him myself. I'm sure I've seen him somewhere." When he got back to Store Send, he found that the marathon conference on the 6th floor down at the Interplanetary Building had finally come to an end. Everybody seemed satisfied, and apparently nobody was going to have pistols and coffee with anybody else about it. "We have things fixed up," his father told him. "The gang who are building the ship out of 4 air freighters are chartered as Janicot Industries Limited. They're going to specialize in chemical products. The other company has a charter now, too. They're going to operate on Jurgen and Horvendil. We'll sell them ships, and Alpha Interplanetary will put on scheduled trips to all 3 planets and also Koshai. We're getting along very nicely with them, except that everybody's competing for technicians and skilled labor. We have 200 more people signed up for Koshai. What you want to do is train as many of them as you can for ship operation. Alpha Interplanetary is going to start a training program here at Store Send." You'd better leave one of your ships for them to work on, and send back as many ships as you can find officers and crews for. We're getting things really started. Yes, the only trouble is, his father frowned, I don't understand these people, Conn. Everybody ought to be making millions out of this by this time next year. But all any of them, even these Storsend bankers, can talk about is how soon we're going to find Merlin. I wish we could stop that somehow. Listen, I have it. Merlin never was on Poictesme. Merlin was a space station a few thousand miles off planet. There was a crew of operators aboard, and they communicated with Force Command by radio. When the war ended, they took it outside the system and shot off a planet buster inside her. No more Merlin. How would that be? His father shook his head. Wouldn't do. If anybody believed it, which I doubt, they'd just quit. The market would collapse. Everybody would be broke. It would be just the end of the war all over again. Conn, we can't let it stop now. We're going too fast to stop. If we tried it, we'd smash up and break our necks. End of Chapter 17. Chapter 18. Jerry Rivas, Mac Vibart, and Luther Chen Wong had been keeping things running on Koshai. Work on the interplanetary ship at Port Carpenter had stopped when the Sickle Mountain ships had been found. It had never been resumed. When Conn returned, he found work started on the Ouroboros too. Some of the 200 newcomers who came on the Helena Loy had special skills needed on the hypership. Most of them went with Clyde Nichols and Charlie Gatworth to Sickle Mountain to train as normal space officers and crewmen. Some of them, it was hoped, would later qualify for hyperspace work. Sylvie, who had been one of the star pupils in the computer class, was now helping him with a long list of needed materials, some of which had to be brought from other places as much as 1,000 miles away. Jerry Rivas went back to exploring. Nichols had to drop his space trading work temporarily to organize a fleet of air freighters. Usually the men best able to operate them were urgently needed on some job at the construction dock. Ships lifted out almost daily from Sickle Mountain. They tried to get some kind of saleable cargo for each one, without depriving themselves of what they needed for themselves. Some of the ships came back loaded with provisions and bringing new recruits. For instance, the teaching of physics and mathematics almost stopped at Storsend College because the professors had been virtually shanghaied. Conn found himself losing touch with affairs on Poictesme. Ships had landed on both Jannicott and Horvendale and were sending back claims to abandoned factories. By that time, they had all the decks into the Ouroboros too, and he was working aboard, getting the astrogational and hyperspace instruments put in place. The hypership Andromeda was back from the Gamma system. There was close secrecy about what the expedition had found, but the newscasts were full of conjectures about Merlin, and the market went into another dizzy upward spiral. Litchfield Exploration and Salvage opened a huge munitions depot, and combat equipment, once almost unsaleable, was selling as fast as it came out. The government was buying some, but by no means all of it. Conn, can you come back here to Poictesme for a while? His father asked. Things have turned serious. I don't like to talk about it by screen. Too many people know our scrambler combinations. But I wish you were here. He started to object. There were millions, well, a couple of hundred things he had to attend to. The look on his father's face stopped him. A ship leaving Sickle Mountain tomorrow morning, he said. I'll be on board. The voyage back to Poictesme was a needed rest. He felt refreshed when he got off at Storsend Spaceport and was met by his father and Wade Lucas in one of the slim recon cars. They greeted him briefly and took the car up and away from the city where it was safe to talk. Conn, I'm scared, his father said. I'm beginning to think there really is a Merlin after all. Oh, come off it. I know it's contagious, but I thought you'd been vaccinated. I'm beginning to think so too, Lucas said. I don't like it at all. You know what that gang who took the Andromeda Preneurs found? They were looking for the plant that fabricated the elements for Merlin, weren't they? Yes, they found it. My Bart Massar operatives got to some of the crew. This place had been turning out material for a computer of absolutely unconventional design. The 2 computer men they had with them couldn't make head or tail of half of it, and every blueprint, every diagram, every scrap of writing or recording had been destroyed. But they found one thing, a big empty fiber folder that had fallen under something and been overlooked. It was marked Top Secret, Project Merlin. Project Merlin could have been anything, Conn started to say. No. Project Merlin was something they made computer parts for. Dolph Kelton's research crew at the library here came across some references to Project Merlin, too. For instance, there was a routine division court-martial, a couple of second lieutenants on a very trivial charge. Force Command ordered the court-martial stopped, and the two officers simply dropped out of the Third Force records. It was stated that they were engaged in work connected with Project Merlin. That's an example. There were half a dozen things like that. Tell him what Kurt Fozzie and his crew found, Wade Lucas said. Yes, they found a 50-foot shaft down from the top of the mesa, almost to the top of the underground headquarters. They found something on top of the headquarters, a disc-shaped mass, 50 feet thick and 100 across, armored in collapsium. It's directly over what used to be Fox Travis' office. That's not a tenth big enough for anything that could even resemble Merlin. Well, it's something. I was out there day before yesterday. They're down to the collapsium on top of this thing. I rode down the shaft in a jeep and looked at it. Look, Conn, we don't know what this Project Merlin was. All this lore about Merlin that's grown up since the war is pure supposition. But Fox Travis told me, categorically, that there was no Project Merlin. Conn said, The war has been over 40 years. It's not a military secret any longer. Why would he lie to me? Why did you lie to Kurt Fozzie and the others and tell them there was a Merlin? You lied because telling the truth would hurt them. Maybe Travis had the same reason for lying to you. Maybe Merlin's too dangerous for anybody to be allowed to find. Great goo. Are you beginning to think Merlin is the devil or Frankenstein's monster? It might be something just as bad, maybe worse. I don't think a man like Fox Travis would lie if he didn't have some overriding moral obligation to. And we know who's been making most of the trouble for us, too, Lucas added. Yes, Roddy Maxwell said, we do. And sometime I'm going to invite Clem Zaref to kick my pants seat. Sam Murchison, the Terran Federation Minister General. How'd you get that? Bart and Massara got some of it. They have an operative planted in Murchison's office, and some of our banking friends got the rest. This Human Supremacy League is being financed by somebody. Every so often, their treasurer makes a big deposit at one of the banks here, all Federation currency, big denomination notes. When I asked them to, they started keeping a record of the serial numbers and checking withdrawals. The money was paid out at the First Planetary Bank to Mr. Samuel S. Murchison, in person. The Armageddonists are getting money too, but they're too foxy to put theirs through the banks. I believe they're the ones who mind-probed Lucy Nocero. Bart and Massara believe, but they can't prove, that human supremacy launched that robobomb at us that time at the spaceport. Have you done anything with those audiovisuals of Liebert? Gave them to Bart and Massara. They haven't gotten anything yet. So we have to admit that Clem Zaref wasn't crazy after all. What do you want me to do? Go out to Force Command and take charge. We have to assume that there may be a Merlin. We have to assume that it may be dangerous. And we have to assume that Kurt Fozzie and his covey of Merlinolators are just before digging it up. Your job is to see that whatever it is doesn't get loose. The trouble was, if he started giving orders around Force Command, he'd stop being a brilliant young man and become a half-baked kid, and one word from him and the older and wiser heads would do just what they pleased. He wondered if the pro-Liebert and anti-Liebert factions were still squabbling. Maybe if he went out of his way to antagonize one side, he'd make allies of the other. He took the precaution of screening in first. Kurt Fozzie, with whom he talked, was almost incoherent with excitement. At least, he was reasonably sure that none of Clem Zaref's trigger-happy mercenaries would shoot him down coming in. The well, 50 feet in diameter, went straight down from the top of the mesa. As the headquarters had been buried under loose rubble, they'd had to vitrify the sides going down. He let down into the hole in a jeep and stood on the collapsium roof of whatever it was they had found. It wasn't the top of the headquarters itself. The microarray scanning showed that. It was a drum-shaped superstructure, a sort of underground penthouse, and there they were stopped. You didn't cut collapsium with a cold chisel or even an atomic torch. He began to see how he was going to be able to take charge here. "You haven't found any passages leading into it?" he asked, when they were gathered in Fozzie's, formerly Fox Travis' office. "Nivel I'm no. If we had, we'd be inside now," Tom Brangwyn swore. "And we've been all over the ceiling in here, and we can't find anything but vitrified rock, and then the collapsium shielding." "Sure, there are collapsium cutters at Port Carpenter on Koshai. They do it with cosmic rays." "But collapsium will stop cosmic rays," Zaref objected. "Stop them from penetrating? Yes. A collapsium cutter doesn't penetrate. It abrades. Throws out a rotary beam and works like a grinding wheel or a buzz saw." "Well, could you get one down that hole?" Judge Ledoux asked. He laughed. "No, the thing is rather too large. In the first place, there's a full-size power reactor and a mass energy converter. With them you produce negamatter, atoms with negatively charged protons and positive electrons, positrons. Then you have to bring them into contact with normal positive matter. That's done in a chamber the size of a 50-gallon barrel, made of collapsium and weighing about 100 tons. Then you have to have a pseudograv field to impart rotary motion to your cosmic ray beam, and the generator door that would lift 10 ships the size of the Lester Dawes. Then you need another 50 to 100 tons of collapsium to shield your cutting head. The cutting head alone weighs 3 tons. The rotary beam that does the cutting, he mentioned as an afterthought, is about the size of a silver 5-centisol piece. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Carl Liebert stated that divine power would aid them. Nobody paid much attention. Liebert's stock seemed to have gone bearish since he had found nothing in the butte, and Fozzie had found that whatever it was on top of Force Command. "Means we're going to have to dig the whole blasted top off clear down to where that thing is," Zaref said. "That'll take a year." "Oh, no. Maybe a couple of weeks after we get started," Conn told them. "It'll take longer to get the stuff loaded on a ship and hauled here than it will to get that thing uncovered and opened." He told them about the machines they used in the iron mines on Koshai, and as he talked, he stopped worrying about how he was going to take charge here. He had just been unanimously elected indispensable man. "Bless you, young man," Carl Liebert cried. "At last, the great computer. Those who come after will reckon this the year zero of the age of regeneration. I will go to my chamber and return thanks in prayer." "He's been doing a lot of praying lately," Tom Brangwyn remarked, after Liebert had gone out. He's moved into the chaplain's quarters, back of the pan-denominational chapel of the 4th level down. Always keeps his door locked, too. "Well, if he wants privacy for his devotions, that's his business. Maybe we could all do with a little prayer," Veltrin said. "Probably praying to Sam Murchison by radio," Clem Zaref retorted. "I'd like to see inside those rooms of his." He called Eves Jackmont at Port Carpenter after dinner. When he told Jackmont what he wanted, and why, the engineer remarked that it was a pity screens couldn't be fitted with olfactory sensors, so they could smell Conn's breath. "I am not drunk. I am not crazy. And I am not exercising my sense of humor. I don't know what Fozzie and his gang have here, but if it isn't Merlin, it's something just as hot. We want at it, soonest, and we'll have to dig a couple of 100 feet of rock off it and open a collapsium can." "How are we going to get that stuff on a ship?" "Anything been done to that normal space job we started since I saw it last? Can you find engines for it? And is there anything about those mining machines or the cutter that would be damaged by space radiation or re-entry heat?" Yves Jacquemont was silent for a good deal longer than the interplanetary time lag warranted. Finally, he nodded. "I get it, Conn. We won't put the things in a ship. We'll build a ship around them. No, that stuff can all be hauled open to space. They use things like that at space stations and on asteroids and all sorts of places. We'll have to stop work on Ouroboros, though. Let Ouroboros wait. We're going to dig up Merlin, and then everybody's going to be rich and happy and live happily forever after." Jacquemont looked at him, silent again for longer than the usual 5.5 minutes. "You almost said that with a straight face." After all, Jacquemont hadn't been cleared yet for the awful truth about Merlin. But, like his daughter, he'd been doing some guessing. "I wish I knew how much of this Merlin stuff you believe." "So do I, Eves. Maybe after we get this thing open, I'll know." To give himself a margin of safety, Jacquemont had estimated the arrival of the equipment at 3 weeks. A week later, he was on screen to report that the skeleton ship, they had christened her The Thing, and when Conn saw screen views of her, he understood why, was finished, and the collapsium cutter and the 2 big mining machines were aboard. Evidently nobody on Koshai had done a stroke of work on anything else. Sylvie's coming along with her. So are Jerry Rivas and Hans Dawes and Hamatsui and Gomez and Karanja and 4 or 5 others. They'll be ready to go to work as soon as she lands and unloads, Jacquemont added. That was good. They were all his own people, unconnected with any of the Merlin hunting factions at Force Command. In case trouble started, he could rely on them. "I'll dig out some shooting irons for them," he advised. "They may need them here." Depending, of course, on what they found when they opened that collapsium can on top of Force Command, and how the people there reacted to it. The Thing took 170 hours to make the trip. Conditions in the small, shielded living quarters and control cabin were apparently worse than on the Harriet Barn on her second trip to Koshai. Everybody at Force Command was anxious and excited. Carl Liebert kept to his quarters most of the time, as though he had to pray the ship across space. At the same time, reports of the near completion of Ouroboros II were monopolizing the newscasts to distract public attention from what was happening at Force Command. Cargo was being collected for. Instead of washing their feet in brandy, next year people would be drinking water. Lorenzo Menardis had emptied his warehouses of everything over a year old. So had most of the other distillers up and down the Gordon Valley. Melon and tobacco planters were talking about breaking new ground and increasing their cultivated acreage for the next year. Agricultural machinery was in high demand and bringing high prices. So were stills and tobacco factory machinery. It began to look as though the Maxwell plan was really getting started. It was decided to send the hypership to Balder on her first voyage. That was Wade Lucas' suggestion. He was going with her himself to recruit scientific and technical graduates from his alma mater, the University of Paris on Balder, and from the other schools there. Conn was enthusiastic about that, remembering the so-called engineers on Koshai running around with a monkey wrench in one hand and a textbook in the other, trying to find out what they were supposed to do while they were doing it. Poictesme had been living for too long on the leavings of wartime production. Too few people had bothered learning how to produce anything. The Thing finally settled onto the mesa top. It looked like something from an old picture of the construction work on one of the Terran space stations in the 1st century. Immediately, every piece of contragravity equipment in the place converged on her. Men dangled on safety lines hundreds of feet above the ground, cutting away beams and braces with torches. The 2 giant mining machines, one after the other, floated free on their own contragravity and settled into place. The Thing lifted, still carrying the collapsium cutting equipment, and came to rest on the brush-grown flat beyond, out of the way. If Eves Jacquemont had overestimated the time required to get the equipment loaded and lifted off from Koshai, Conn had been over-optimistic about the speed with which the top of the mesa could be stripped off. Digging away the rubble with which the pit had been filled and even the solid rock around it was easier than getting the stuff out of the way. Farm scows came in from all over as fast as they and pilots for them could be found. The rush to get brandy and tobacco to Store Send had caused an acute shortage of vehicles. One by one, the members of the old Fozzie's office gang came drifting in. Lorenzo Menardis, Morgan Gatworth, Lester Dawes. None of them had any skills to contribute, but they brought plenty of enthusiasm. Rodney Maxwell came whizzing out from Store Send now and then to watch the progress of the work. Of all the crowd, he and Conn watched the 2 steel giants strip away the tableland with apprehension instead of hope. No, there was a third. Carl Liebert had stopped secluding himself in his quarters. He still talked rapturously about the miracles Merlin would work, but now and then Conn saw him when he thought he was unobserved. His face was the face of a condemned man. The Ouroboros, too, was finished. The whole planet saw, by screen, the ship lift out, watched from the ship the dwindling away of Koshai, and saw Poictesme grow ahead of her. 12 hours before she landed, work at Force Command stopped. Everybody was going to Stor's End. Sylvie, whose father would command her on her voyage to Boulder, Morgan Gatworth, whose son would be first officer and astrogator. Everybody. Except Carl Liebert. "And I'm not going either," Clem Zarov decided. "Somebody's got to stay here and keep an eye on that snake." "No, nor me," Tom Brangwyn said. "And if he starts praying again, I'm going to go and pray along with him." Conn stayed too. And so did Jerry Rivas and Ans Dawes. They watched the newscast of the lift-out a week later. It was peaceful and harmonious. Everybody, regardless of their attitudes on Merlin, seemed to agree that this was the beginning of a new prosperity for the planet. There were speeches. The bands played Genji Gartner's Body and the Spaceman's Hymn. And at last, when the officers and crew were going aboard, Conn saw his sister Flora clinging to Wade Lucas' arm. She was one of the small party who went aboard for a final farewell. When she came off, along with Sylvie, she was wiping her eyes, and Sylvie was comforting her. Seeing that made Conn feel better, even than watching the ship itself lift away from Stor's End. End of Chapter 18.